Oh, no, that's not right. Hi guys, Michael here. So, as many of you know, I am a huge fan of rocketry and the entire American space program. Apollo is definitely a high point. And, as such, I love the Saturn V. And as you might guess, as an engineer, I grew up with Legos. And I still love Legos. And that's why a few years ago, when the Lego Saturn V came out, I bought one. And I have it with me here today. This beautiful piece of Lego engineering is by far my favorite in my collection of Legos. And we're going to be talking about it again today, except I have a little bit of a backstory. So, as you might know, I am a college student, and first 2 years I lived on campus, and I now live off campus. As such, I had to pack this up at the end of last year and move it to my new apartment. Unfortunately, in doing so, I made the unfortunate mistake of lifting it by the third stage, and as a result, the entire thing went crashing to the ground, and you can see the result in this picture here. So, I rebuilt it in about half an hour. However, about a few weeks later, when I was, finally leaving the apartment and just checking that I hadn't left anything behind, I found this, which, if it will focus, you will see, it won't focus, it's a little Lego brick, blue Lego brick that, as it was the only Lego I had in my dorm, it had to have come from this. And today, we are going to take this entire thing apart and see if I could figure out where this little guy belongs. And I know that may sound a bit boring, so I'm going to take that time to also talk about the entire Saturn V in as much detail as I feel necessary. So, we can get started. I know that when I dropped it because I was holding it by the third stage. So we know that this little blue part is not from the third stage, because this thing was still intact when everything else was shattered on the floor. So this, not only did it perform as the third stage of the Saturn V, sending the crew to the moon, but it also functioned as the upper stage of the Saturn V, as well as being modified later in history into the first Skylab space station. Only Skylab, first American space station. Also, because it served as the third stage of the Saturn V, when the Skylab program happened, they had everything from the third stage and above. It was identical to a Saturn V launch. So instead of going back to launch pads for the dedicated Saturn V launch pads that has since been demolished, they made slight modifications to the Saturn V pad to make the Saturn V fit. And those modifications were called the milk stool by some. It's kind of a cool piece of Apollo history. So let's move on to taking apart the first stage, because that is my current guess as to where this part came from. And the first stage, also known as the S1C, is by far the most interesting, maybe not the most interesting, but the most powerful stage of the entire Saturn V. As you can see in this Lego, it was absolutely massive, powered by 5 F1 engines. Now, the F1s are still the largest single-chamber rocket engine in the world. So we'll start tearing this down. The S4B, or the S1C, is a monster, powered by 5 F1s, which still hold the record today, fueled entirely by kerosene and liquid oxygen, while the rest of the Saturn V was fueled by liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. We can see a few of those little blue parts in the corners here. Unfortunately, all 4 of those are there, so that is not where this one came from. So that's one possibility eliminated. The way this is built, these rails are identical, and these rails are identical, but they're different from each other. So, let's see, tearing down this side. Yes, that blue brick is also there. So it didn't come from that side either. Let's see, we can pull off the engine here. The F1, which is actually a really good representation. This actually, if anyone has actually seen what an F1 looks like, this is actually a pretty good representation. Anyway, we can reach over here and pull off this whole rail, and we can look if there's any missing blue pieces. So while I have this side off, we can also look at some of the construction here. You can see kind of cylinders here and then structure here and here, which actually matches the construction of the actual S1C. The kerosene tank sat down here, the oxygen tank sat up here, with the interstage sitting here. This is what it actually separated about here. This part went with the second stage for a few moments of flight before also being discarded away. That's that famous piece of footage of that ring falling away from the Saturn V in flight. Yeah, I'm looking in here and I don't see where that blue brick might have come from. So we can start putting this back together real quick. I have, as I said, torn this down plenty of times. I have a rough idea of where parts are supposed to be. This is the most challenging section of the build. Just pull that off. We can put this side back on. Get this secure. And then slide in this forward connector. This thing is built very, very strong. That's on. Now we can pull off these two side rails and break them in the process. Oops. But goes away. We can pull off these top pieces. And pop those. And raise this off the floor. Just slide this bit right here in. No, okay. 30%. Slide that in. Slide that back down. And now I can rebuild this. Got it. There. Reattaching these. It's actually really smart how this is built. So the whole thing is built kind of a common linear structure with these rails sitting in the corners and kind of these front panels. Kind of an octagonal structure, but it does a great job of approximating a obviously a circular vehicle. So I've got to, give a good amount of applause to the guys who designed this, because they did a phenomenal job building a circular rocket out of the Lego system, which, for those who have used Lego, know that the Legos are built on a square grid structure. So that obviously must have been a challenge in the design, but they did a great job with it. So we can slide this F1 engine back in, and we build this rail side here. And back in. All these side rails back on down on the bottom here. There are a series of these parts that just slide right on here. And coincidentally, the entire Saturn V would have sat on this portion of the rocket. The entire weight on the pad sat on 4 attachment points located roughly here. So that's a cool little bit of Saturn V history. And as I mentioned, this structure up here would have been the interstage, which sat between the first and second stages. It's actually what these little rails sticking out here are. If I bring this close, you can see they kind of jut out the side. So what those represent are the solid rocket motors. At first stage separation, a series of rockets located down here would have fired forward to pull the first stage away, and after the explosive bolts would have fired up here separating the first stage from the interstage, those would have fired to pull this away, and the interstage, now attached to the second stage, would fire a series of motors to push that entire stack forward. If you look at footage of the Saturn V launch, there's a massive explosion that happens at that point, with the forward firing thrust and the rear firing thrust interacting with each other, creating a very spectacular staging event. But that's what the interstage was for. It would carry these motors to accelerate the second stage, and then after a few seconds of flight, the interstage would separate up here, falling away from the second stage. and clearing away from these engines. Reason for that is at first stage cutoff, the tanks here would have gone into free fall. 0G, and the fluids would have been sloshing around. That firing of the engines in the interstage would have resettled all the fuel down to the bottom of the tank, allowing proper fuel pressure to start these engines. Now we can look at the second stage, which is actually one of the best engineered stages on the entire Saturn V. The entire Saturn V, as it was being developed, the entire thing had a certain mass budget, and during development, the lunar module kept getting heavier, and as a result, the entire rocket had to get lighter. The third stage was already basically finished, and the first stage was very far along, so none of the mass could come out of either of those two. So they told the guys building the second stage that they had to make it lighter. And one of the ways they did is something called a common bulkhead, where if we pull this side panel off, we might be able to get a glimpse of. As you can see, unlike the first stage, which has, it has the interstage, or sorry, the first stage. So the first stage, you can see tank here, your inner tank structure here, which is just structure, no tank. That's why it has that distinct grid-y look to it. It's the structure. You can see you don't see that here. You can see the tankage here, that inner structure, and then your upper fairing connecting to your third stage. If you look inside, you can see it's all one tank, when in real life the whole thing would have been two tanks. So what they did is, instead of it being two separate tanks, like on the first stage, without it being two separate tanks with a good amount of structure in between, it was two tanks sharing a common wall. That presents a lot of problems in terms of the difference in temperature between liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. But the benefit is you take an entire tank wall out, and you get substantially lighter. Again, we can see we have a common structure with the main panels going up the side here, the series of offset rails. And again, that creates a very circular structure. But again, I'm seeing blue parts here and here. They're both there. Earlier, I had seen there's a blue part here that isn't in either of these three parts, but that's because this rail is a different design than these other three. So that's not where that blue brick came from. Next, let's look at the interstage up here. One cool thing about the design, if this would focus, come on, there we go. One thing you can see is it has two attachment points, or attachment pairs, whereas the first stage has a series of 4. That's why the first and second stage connection is a lot stronger than here. Oh, wait, you know what else I noticed? I think I found where that blue brick goes. It's actually kind of cool. They used hinges to create that. But you can see, if we pull 2 off side by side, there it is. This little blue brick belongs right about there. Mystery solved. And now we can put this whole thing back together. Sliding that, we can actually look at how this thing would have been stacked in real life. Because all 3 stages to the Saturn V arrived at the vehicle assembly building independently of each other. The first stage would have actually arrived without these side panels installed, because that actually would have reduced the overall diameter and allowed for easier transportation. So it would have arrived at the VAB and had these installed, at which point first stage would have been lifted onto the pad and mounted down by those 4 attachment points I mentioned earlier. And the swing arms would have been swung over and mounted to the side of the vehicle. The second stage would have been lifted and dropped in like this, although in some cases they would have pulled the interstage off, or it mounted the interstage to the second stage before stacking the two. It differed between Apollo missions. Then lastly, this interstage would not have been installed because the lift ring was actually here. So they would have lifted the first stage without its interstage, mounted it, mounted the interstage to the second stage, dropped this whole thing on top, and then this forward interstage would have actually been mounted to the back side of the S4B. It would have been lifted with the 2 of them, then placed up on top. Right, like so. And that would have completed the Saturn V launch vehicle. So the Apollo spacecraft would have been stacked with the fairings, crew module, and the lunar module, which I actually have over there. I'm not going to put it in here. That would have been lifted, fully assembled, and placed up on top after everything was stacked. And then the entire thing would have rolled out. If you ever have the chance to go to Houston, Texas, or Kennedy Space Center, Johnson Space Center in Houston or Kennedy Space Center in Florida, they both have actual Saturn V's on display. I've seen the one at Kennedy many times, and I can never get over the raw size of this thing. Just for scale, this first stage engine, the F1, is 12 feet in diameter. I could stand inside that thing twice, and because I'm short, still have room. The Saturn V is a massive, massive beast of engineering. Also still the tallest rocket ever launched at 363 feet tall, counting the launch escape tower. So that concludes this video. I want to thank you guys for watching. This is kind of a, fun video. It's done a little bit different. And talking more about space stuff, because that is what I enjoy. I have a few ideas for a few other space videos coming up, so subscribe if you want to see those when they come up. So with that, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I guess I'll see you next time with plenty more space stuff. So, I'll see you then. My name is Michael. See you later.